Welcome back. We've been talking about how Core 180 is a course in evaluating economic argument. And we've been talking about how to evaluate these economic arguments, we need to engage that critical part of our mind. But we also need to know something or two about arguments. And this part of the lecture is going to be very cursory. This is not Dr. Penfield's logic course. But it's going to be helpful if we have common language that we can all talk about arguments from. What an argument is a reason for thinking a statement or claim. And this is different from an opinion, which is statement one holds to be true. Whereas an argument is an organized set of statements, one of which we want to prove. And that thing that we want to prove is our conclusion. So an argument is just a bunch of premises, statements which support a conclusion, and that thing that we want to be supported, that thing we're trying to prove. So when I say Hollands will lose the championship because they have the worst team, there we have a premise, Hollands has the worst team, and a conclusion, that therefore they will lose the championship. So when we say an argument is a set of statements, what's a statement? A statement is a declarative sentence. And what makes it declarative is this sentence is either true or false, and we can test whether this statement is true or false. So both of these are statements. The James is a river in Lynchburg, and Sweetbriar is a college in California. The difference between them is one is a true statement and the other is a false statement, Sweetbriar, of course, being in Virginia. Whereas neither of the following are statements. You must come to class. Please give me a good teaching evaluation, and do you like Core 180? So take a minute to ask yourself why none of these are statements. And the reason why is this first one, you must come to class, that's a command. Please give me a good teaching evaluation, that's a request, both of which are forms of imperatives. And do you like Core 180, that's a question, an interrogative. So now that we know what makes up an argument, these set of statements, these premises, and these conclusions, we want to know what makes a good argument, because we're not just concerned with arguments in general, but what makes them good. And this is true for us overall, but it's going to be more and more true as we get to some of these economic foundations. So consider the following. Sweetbriar is in Virginia. Virginia is a commonwealth. Therefore, and this is what the person is trying to argue, therefore, Sweetbriar has an excellent equestrian program. So is this a good argument? And the answer is no. But why is it a bad argument, since everything here is true? Sweetbriar is in Virginia. Virginia is a commonwealth, and Sweetbriar does have an excellent equestrian program. But the problem is not that any of these things are false. It's that this conclusion, Sweetbriar has an excellent equestrian program, does not flow from the premises we put forth. The premises have nothing to do with whether or not the conclusion is true, and sometimes, unfortunately, in some years, our equestrians aren't up to snuff. And if an argument exists where the premises can be true, that Sweetbriar is in Virginia and Virginia is a commonwealth, but the conclusion isn't necessarily true, if you can have a situation where you have true premises and a false conclusion, we call this argument invalid. Put differently, if it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false, we call the argument valid. So note that this is a statement, this validity is a test of argumentative flow. Let's see some examples. Mindhunter is on Netflix. All Netflix shows are good, therefore Mindhunter is a good show. Handmaid's Tale is on Hulu. All Netflix shows are good, therefore Handmaid's Tale is a bad show. Now this argument is valid, whereas the second is valid. It's impossible for a show that's on Netflix to be bad if all Netflix shows are good is a true statement. Meanwhile, it is possible for a show that's on Hulu to be good if all we know is that all Netflix shows are also good. So this first argument is a valid argument. Its conclusion must logically flow from the premises, whereas the second argument is an invalid argument because its conclusion does not necessarily logically flow from the premises. And when we want to test whether an argument is valid or invalid, what we should do is construct a counterexample. And this is an informal test, but we simply describe a situation where the conclusion is false given true premises. So in this example, Sloane jumped out of an airplane, therefore Sloane fell to her death. Take a minute and try and construct a counterargument. Well, what if the airplane was on the ground? Then Sloane probably didn't fall from her death. Let's add some complexity to this argument and see if we can still construct a counterargument. Sloane jumped out of an airplane without a parachute while traveling at 300 miles per hour at a 10,000-foot elevation. Therefore, Sloane fell to her death. Now this one, it might be a little bit more difficult to construct a counterargument, but perhaps we still can. Suppose Sloane was part of a dive team and jumping in tandem. So though she didn't have a parachute, maybe her partner did. Finally, once we understand validity, we can evaluate what those truthful statements are. Remember, validity is a question of flow. What soundness is a question of truth. So we only care about the truth of a premise if we already know that the argument is valid. If an argument is valid and its premises are true, then we call the argument sound. In other words, all sound arguments are valid, but not all valid arguments are necessarily sound. Now let's see what this means by way of example. And let's go back to those examples we were working with earlier. So Mindhunter is on Netflix. All Netflix shows are good. Therefore, Mindhunter is a good show. Handmaid's Tale is on Hulu. All Netflix shows are good. Handmaid's Tale is a bad show. So while this first argument is a valid argument, it's not necessarily sound because there are shows on Netflix that are not good. And an argument is sound if and only if it is a valid argument that has true premises. Similarly, since the second argument is invalid from the start, it can't be sound because an argument has to be valid before it can be sound. Now let's close this little mini lecture by noting that soundness often requires that we have additional information. And this is where not just our knowledge of logic and critical thinking come into play, but also these economic and financial foundations that we're going to learn throughout this course come into play. So if someone makes an economic argument to you, like we should restrict trade with China, you need to evaluate their argument not just for validity, but also dig into these economic principles we're going to learn and say, well, hey, this is what I know about trade, so even though there's logical flow to your argument, perhaps those premises aren't true. With that, let's close out this little mini lecture video and regroup in the next one.